Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving straight into something absolutely wild today. Have you ever wondered how the high-budget, terrifying psychological music of a classic Hollywood thriller somehow accidentally defined the sound of a dusty cattle drive TV show? Well, we're going to see exactly how a composer's most terrifying musical ideas ended up on the open frontier, totally transforming the way we see the American West. Ghostwriting their nightmares while they sat there eating their TV dinners. Just think about that for a second. It's a pretty provocative thought, right? But this is exactly what an uncredited composer was doing to millions of completely unsuspecting viewers back in the 1960s. Families would just kick back in their living rooms for some standard entertainment, completely unaware that an acoustic master was actively hijacking their subconscious. Okay, let's dive into part 1, the anatomy of dread. To really get how this mass manipulation happened, we have to start by looking at the absolute musical genius of a composer named Bernard Herrmann. This was a guy who completely rewrote the rules of what cinematic music does to the human brain. Usually, a movie soundtrack is like a giant neon sign. The hero wins, the strings swell. It's safe, it's binary, and it's basically the director telling you exactly how to feel. But Herrmann entirely rejected that standard melodic comfort. Instead of holding your hand, he drops you straight into a landscape of unresolved distance and, well, pure existential dread. A perfect example of this is his work on the famous film Vertigo. Herrmann created something called the Vertigo chord. Basically, he takes an E-flat minor chord and squishes it directly together with a D major chord. I want you to imagine the famous visual dolly zoom from that movie. You know, the shot where the camera pushes backward while zooming forward. The Vertigo chord is the direct acoustic equivalent of that mind-bending camera trick. Think of it like an acoustic optical illusion. That E-flat minor chord forcefully pulls your mood down into the darkness, but at the exact same time, the D major chord is brightly pushing upward. Your brain literally cannot process both of those conflicting emotional directions simultaneously. The result? He is literally hacking your ears to cause a profound feeling of musical vertigo. And to deliver this hacked audio, he completely ditched the soaring romantic strings you'd usually expect from standard Hollywood fare. Forget about them. Herrmann relied on the unconventional, eerie electronic hum of Hammond organs and incredibly chilling vibraphones. These very specific, strange instruments perfectly mapped out the steep, foggy geography of San Francisco and matched a mind's dizzying descent right into obsession. Which brings us to part 2, mass-producing TV nightmares. So here is where the story pivots from high art cinema to something much more industrial. See, Herrmann soon realized that this kind of deep psychological manipulation didn't actually require a massive Hitchcock-sized budget. And hey, even musical geniuses have to pay the rent, right? That necessity led to a system that essentially mass-produced this cinematic dread for the everyday living room. Back in the 60s, TV shows needed massive volumes of music instantly. So CBS used this tracking system. Step 1, Herrmann goes to Europe and records highly modular thematic suites. Step 2, network editors in the US literally take physical razor blades and slice up this magnetic tape. And Step 3, they anonymously paste these tracks of pure tension directly into weekly broadcast television wherever a scene needed an edge. The scale of this is just staggering. Millions of everyday people were having their subconscious absolutely manipulated by cinematic-level dread while just trying to watch standard TV. And Herrmann? He received absolutely zero on-screen credit for this. He was an uncredited master, a phantom in the broadcasting booth, fundamentally altering the mood of the American public on a weekly basis. Let's move to part 3, the accidental gritty Western. This brings us to the collision that changed a genre forever. What happens when this mass-produced psychological terror crashes straight into a dusty standard cattle drive show called Rawhide? Now, normally a standard 1950s Western had these bright, optimistic major chords, wide-open spaces, and Aaron Copland style that honestly sounded a bit like a beef commercial. But then CBS editors run out of original happy music for Rawhide. So what do? They reach for Herrmann's library tape. Suddenly, you've got these low, guttural woodwinds and relentless creeping rhythms dropped right onto the open plains. Overnight, the fun frontier adventure transformed into a terrifying, empty void. Now, add the final ingredient to this mix. Rawhide featured a breakout star, a young Clint Eastwood. Eastwood was already known for his intensely stoic, minimalistic acting style. I mean, the guy barely even spoke, but he didn't really need dialogue, because those brooding Herrmann woodwinds, hovering ominously in the background, were doing all the heavy lifting. They gave Eastwood's silent scowl all the immense psychological weight it could ever possibly need. So, the crucial point here is that by simply pasting Herrmann's anti-heroic dread behind Eastwood's quiet intensity, CBS inadvertently invented the gritty spaghetti western aesthetic, and they did it years before it was ever popularized by others. It is wild to think that such an iconic pop culture shift was a completely accidental synergy, born entirely out of a television network's music budget cuts. All right, part 4, stripping away humanity. This musical tracking proved to be so incredibly effective that eventually the executives at CBS stopped slicing up old tapes and actually hired Bernard Herrmann to score a bespoke episode of Rawhide directly. The date is August 1965. The episode is a grim, violent story called Encounter at Boot Hill. Herrmann enters the studio for what would become a legendary, frankly staggering recording session, completed in just a single afternoon. And the choices he made that day perfectly encapsulate his uncompromising vision. Take a look at this number, 13. Out of an entire symphony orchestra available to him, Herrmann chose to use a total of exactly 13 instruments to score this entire episode. It is a shockingly low count. Now, what's really interesting about this is the number 0, because out of those 13 instruments, there were exactly 0 strings. Not a single violin, viola, or cello was allowed in the room. Why would a composer cut the most common section of the orchestra? Well, in traditional music, strings provide human warmth. They give you that comforting emotion. By completely removing them, you essentially remove the humanity from the score entirely. Instead, Herrmann relied exclusively on the lowest register woodwinds. We're talking bassoons, bass clarinets, plus 3 trombones and some percussion. It resulted in an unbelievably bleak, hollow, and lonely soundscape that perfectly matched the grim frontier. Which brings us to our final chapter, part 5, the invisible wallpaper music. As we wrap up this explainer, let's connect this amazing piece of musical history back to the bigger picture, and really back to you. This story proves that creating true psychological weight doesn't demand a giant orchestra or a massive Hollywood budget. It just requires an uncompromising vision. Because whether you're navigating a dizzying San Francisco stairwell or riding down a dusty, lonely cattle trail, the human mind responds to the exact same underlying architectural dread. Herrmann figured out the acoustic blueprint for that dread, and television blasted it right into the living room. Which leaves us with a final lingering thought for you to chew on. If a completely uncredited, spliced-up piece of background music could subconsciously transform a heroic frontier into an existential nightmare for millions of people in 1960, how is the invisible, everyday wallpaper music of the modern media you consume subtly dictating your own perception of reality right now? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. I really hope it changes how you listen to your favorite shows from now on.